Well, this morning I want to start by telling you guys a story. It's a story about a man named Robert MacGregor. And Robert, growing up, was one of those people, man. Friends used to joke with him and say he had the Midas touch, man. Everything he touched would turn to gold. And so Robert was very successful in pretty much everything he did growing up. He was an athlete. As school went on, though, he noticed he was very good in economics and finance classes and business classes, and so he ended up deciding to go to college and study finance, and through undergrad and graduate school, he ended up getting a degree in economics. And right after college, Robert went into a job in corporate finance. Basically was doing something like managing hedge funds, which is basically telling rich people where to invest their money. And as time went on, the same thing was said about Robert, been said about him his whole life, man. Everything he touched would turn to gold. And through different ventures and different investments, Robert gained a bit of a reputation as someone that would always pick the companies that people should invest in. And so his reputation would precede him. And he went on to make millions of dollars for the company and for himself. But after some time, after Robert had been in the business for a while, he was approached by his CEO, who sat him down and said, "Robert, you made this company a lot of money, and we'd like to offer you now a management position where you'd be training people to do what you did. There's something about you, you know how to make money, and it's very clear you'd be good in this company. It would be a little bit of decrease in pay, but it would be good for you to do this. You could spend more time with your kids." At this time, Robert had 2 kids. He got married to a girl that he knew in college. And so Robert left that meeting with kind of a decision on his hands, and basically decided whether to stay in the game, what he'd been doing, which is being in the game, doing the investing, or to manage and teach people how to do it. But at that same time, all the friends that Robert had made came to him and said, "Robert, no man, you can't go into management. That's not fun, man. We got to stay in the game. You know, you're the most successful person this company has ever seen. You've made more money than anyone ever could. You know, you're the most famous investor in this company. Hey, I bet that if you worked at this for another 10 or 15 years, you could be the most famous investor, the richest person that maybe the country has ever seen." And Robert fell in love with those people's words. Robert thought to himself, "Man, that sounds good. I want to be the most successful investor that this company has ever seen, maybe the world has ever seen." So rather than take the job, which Robert could have done, which was spend more time with his family, spend time with his sons that had been born, Robert chose to stay in the game. So 5, 10, 15 years passed, and Robert is still in this world of finance. All the things that his friends said could happen did happen, man. He made more money than anyone ever made. He was on magazine covers. He made the company millions of dollars by doing the same thing, which was telling people where to make their money. But after this happened, man, as time went on, Robert would miss game after game, match after match, vacation after vacation, spending time away from his family because he chose to listen to his friends and to listen to himself and say, "I want to make more money." So because of that, you know, if we go 15, 20 years down the line, Robert is again in this place where he's saying, "Man, I'll just do it a little bit longer, man. My kids are going to thank me someday. My wife is going to thank me someday." But as we come in on the story, Robert is an older man in his 50s, and the day starts like any other day, like it normally would be. And Robert wakes up. He has a bit of a headache, but that's pretty normal for him. He kind of is used to burning the candle at both ends, as they say. He basically is used to working long nights, early mornings. So woke up with a bit of a headache and didn't really think much of it. Took aspirin, drank some coffee, went into work. As he got into work, he started noticing, man, around his eyes and stuff, he was getting kind of a tension headache, and he couldn't, looking up the lights when they started to hurt his eyes, but didn't really think much of it again. Went to his lunch meeting. At his meeting, he ended up getting sick and had to leave the meeting, man. He started vomiting in the bathroom, and so he, man, I need to go home. And so he went back to the office, told his secretary he would not be there, and as he was going out to his car, Robert passed out in the parking garage. Come in on the scene later on, and Robert is in his hospital bed alone because his family, sons are all grown up, not much relationship with their dad. His wife is away doing something else. Their relationship has turned into more of a status and a finance thing than anything. And a nurse is there, and she notices that Robert's awake. They go and get the doctor to come in. While Robert's sitting there all alone, the doctor relays a story to him about a tumor that's in his head that is inoperable. Robert really quickly realizes, man, all the zeros in my bank account, all the cars, all the property, all the success, all the fame, they didn't amount to much. And the doctors gave him a diagnosis that he had about a month to live. Now this vignette I just told you is a little bit of man, what I felt like I wanted to do to kind of show an example of how Jesus would teach, man. I got the opportunity to do the parable of the rich fool, and although it differs from the story in many ways, it really is how I felt it would. When Jesus was teaching, as we've been talking about the way he would teach in parable, that's the way I kind of felt like this was, is that, man, he would take a modern day scenario. It makes a little bit less sense for us in the context we're in, for a farmer who hoards his wealth to, man, someone maybe an investment or in the kind of world that we see or the way that we watch on TV and watch in movies. And so that's kind of the way I wanted to explain this parable today. And as we go into this parable, I know a lot of times our tendency, my tendency in preaching is to do a lot more about application, a lot more about reasoning. Today I want to kind of go into, man, what is God telling us in this parable today? What are the things that God feels about what the choices that the rich fool makes? What are the things that God thinks about the way that we live when we choose to make money our priority? You know, one of the first things that stood out to me in this parable, it comes in this. And in case you guys don't know the story of the rich fool, it's a little bit of a less common parable. It's only actually found in Luke's gospel. And basically the story is very similar to Robert's, and this is a man that is very wealthy and farming. And so what he ends up doing is making the choice, rather than to give because he has an abundance, he makes the choice, and it comes in right here in verse 15, and in verse 18 he says this, and he said, I will do this, I will tear down my barns and build large ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. That's the first thing I notice is very quickly pride comes in to the farmer's heart, the rich fool's heart. You know, there's not really a reason for him to do this except for pride. He has enough in his barns, he has enough room where he could do something else with the grain, he could give it away. He could even make money off it by selling it, but what he chooses to do is just to hoard it by building larger barns that are unnecessary. I think very quickly it's the same for us, is that pride comes into our life. You know, the Bible says over and over again that God is distant from the haughty, he's distant from the proud, he could draw near to the humble. I think the heart of God in our finance is not that finance is evil, but when it becomes an area of pride, it's when it becomes a problem for us. I think the second thing that really stood out to me in this passage comes later on, and it comes in verse 22, and it says, and it's actually right after it says, "Do not worry." This is okay. Sorry. The entire discourse that we find in Luke 11 and 12 is basically a study. As I went back and looked at what Jesus is saying in Luke 11 and what Jesus is also saying in Luke 12, these people, is basically Jesus attacks the different areas which we try to place idols ahead of God. Right before in Luke 12, what he's saying is, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Man, what we see is a problem that Jesus has with people who are trying to earn their salvation, people who are trying to make their own deeds their righteousness. You know, as it goes on, again, it's not having the fear of man. You know, further on it says, acknowledge Christ before men. All these things that we tend to set up in our lives as idols. You know, and Luke, and again, I think it's so pertinent that it makes sense that he addresses the next one as something that we love to make an idol in our life, is that riches is something that we absolutely love to make an idol in our life. I think the reality is, in the parable of the rich fool, as you go on, it says this, after he decides he's going to build his barn, it says, I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Verse 20, God says something very similar to the vignette I told in the beginning. It says, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? See, Robert, in the same way that this rich fool realizes all these things they've laid up that he wanted to do, that he wanted to live for himself, that he wanted to gain, that he wanted to have, he was setting plans for a future that didn't necessarily exist. I think that's the thing that God is really saying loudest to us in the parable of the rich fool, is that we don't really have tomorrow. I think it's something that is a really foreign idea to us. It's very hard to even pull that into grasp in a culture where we have health, a culture where we have, obviously, because a college student's a little bit varying for us, but we have some sense of security and wealth. I mean, if you really want to work hard and go out and get a part-time job, you're not going to struggle for money here. Most people are blessed to have parents. I know that I am, who have supported me and really helping take out student loans even though they are in my name. But right now, I think it's something we have a hard time understanding, that tomorrow isn't promised, because in so many ways, what are we told, man? Worry about your future. Tomorrow is promised. But I think that's something that God declares so loudly in this parable is, no, like your tomorrows really aren't promised. And in Luke 12:15, which is the verse that comes right before this, it says, one's life does not come in the abundance of possessions. And I think that that's something that we struggle with very strongly in our lives, is that we find life in things besides God. It's the human condition of this focus on tomorrow, this focus on our future, this focus on other things besides God. And we see this happening all throughout Luke 11 and Luke 12. I think God tells us so loud in this passage, man, that his desire is to be our sufficiency. I love the way it was summed up in Luke 12:21 in the Message. And it says this is what happens when you fill your barns with self and not with God. That again, this is what happens when you fill your life when your barns with self and not with God. I think that's something that we do all the time, man. It's so easy for me to focus on my future, to focus on where I'm heading, to focus on this tomorrow, which is so, this parable almost comes across harsh sometimes. As I'm reading it, as we're reading it over and over again, as we're told to study these parables, man, this parable comes across harsh to me. Because I think a lot of times if we look at the way this guy lives his life, I think a financial planner would look at this guy's life and say, yeah, that's a good decision, man. He would say, yeah, you should build bigger barns. If you have more stuff, you need it to store up more, you need to make more money. And it's this posture that Jesus is trying to teach us to say, no, you don't even know if you have tomorrow. You don't know about your tomorrow. This is not something that I share very much. It's not something that I am completely very open with in my life, but the past 2 years of my life, for a lot of you that I maybe haven't told, have been some of the hardest years of my entire life. My family and I have experienced by far the biggest tragedies that I've ever had to experience. 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, my parents got divorced, and in that time period, it was very confusing for me. It was very hard. I grew up with pastors for parents, and so, but luckily, by the grace of God, we had a family really step into our lives. My Uncle Mike and my Aunt Carol really became like parents to me. We'd grown up friends our entire life, and they have kids that are our age, and so, man, my cousins Brittany and Grant are like my brother and sister. And so 2 years ago, I remember I was sitting at my house in Puyallup, and I got a call from my dad, and I kind of heard rumblings of it, that an accident happened, and I needed to pray for my cousin, my brother Grant. And essentially what happened 2 years ago is my brother Grant went into the hospital for a spinal meningitis test, and because he'd been sick for a couple weeks, he kind of grew up with a history of illness. The doctors thought they saw some signs, and so what they did was a spinal tap, and as a result of the spinal tap, Grant went into a coma without the doctors knowing it. As a result, in the time period that elapsed right there, Grant's had sustained an anoxic brain injury, which has left him a vegetable. And I remember hearing the words from my dad and just literally falling to the ground. This didn't make sense. This wasn't fair. My cousin had a 4.2. He's one of those kids, man. He was on a full ride scholarship to Point Loma. He was 17 years old going towards high school graduation in 4 months, and that happened. And our lives were thrown upside down, man. That's not supposed to happen to him. It's not supposed to happen to people, but I think this is the kind of thing that just gets shouted in this parables. We're not promised tomorrow. Later on in that same year, while we're walking through this injury that happened to my brother Grant, my Aunt Carol, my Mama Carol, after fighting breast cancer and beating it one time, it came back in force, and it took over her entire body. And after this insane tragedy happens with my brother, my aunt passes away from breast cancer. I remember sitting there and looking at this family, and I'm like, God, this doesn't make sense to me. God, I don't understand this. This isn't your will. How could this be your will? God, our families have been through so much together. Man, they're already walking through so much with their son. God, how could this be? I think the reality of these situations that I've just had to come to in my life is that it's this problem with our fallen world that, man, we're not promised tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Someday we will be promised eternity. And that's the thing that comforts my heart, is that someday, man, we're going to sit at the feet of Jesus and know that, man, this is what it's going to be like forever. But in this life right now, all the things that we place in our life as idols and that we place as our forms of security, man, I don't know if they're going to be there tomorrow. You know, I think it says one of his best ways in James 4:14 says, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Again, in Psalm 90, verse 12, Moses writes, so teach us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. This heart that would understand that maybe I don't, you know, I'm a man. I'm a human. We're fallen. We don't know how long we have. I think it gets summed up the best, and this is kind of where I want to conclude, is, you know, in the past 2 years, it's been one of my hardest times struggling with God, where I don't understand His will, I don't understand His sovereignty. But I love the heart of Job here, and I kind of want us to finish up right here. And in Job 1:21, it says, after all this tragedy happens in Job's life, man, him losing all of his property, all of his possessions, all of his relationships, all of his children, even losing his own health, it says this. And Job said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I think that's really summed up the heart I think Jesus wants us to experience when we read a parable like the parable of the rich fool. You came in this world naked. One thing you can be sure is you're leaving here naked too. And that's kind of where our hearts need to be. Man, if at all today this stuck out to you, I want to give a time for a response. And I'd like to pray for you guys if it all means something to you. Is, man, if you want to say, God, I want this to be my heart, to number my days, to gain wisdom from that. Let you raise your hand. Thank you.